Hello everybody. Today we're going to clean and fix a TurboGrafx-16 or PC-Engine controller. So here's what we're going to need for this job. Some isopropyl alcohol. I recommend 95% if you can find it, but we're using 91% here. Phillips head screwdriver, a couple of Q-tips, good old-fashioned pink eraser like from elementary school, a glass, and of course the controller. First things first, you want to unplug the controller from the console. It's really important that you actually unplug from where the controller connects to the console, because this port, this connection, has been known to break, especially on the TurboGrafx-16. So use some care and some caution when unplugging it from the console. So the first thing we're going to do on the controller itself is take out the Phillips screws in the back of the controller. Flip it over, there's a screw in each one of these holes. These are tiny little screws. I advise, if you can, do this job over a tile or something that's not carpet, because these things can get lost really easy. So we're going to open it up from the back so none of the parts fall on the floor or anything like that. There's a little wire here. That's where it's in. I'm going to undo that. And then remove this piece ever so carefully. And as you can see, there's not much to a TurboGrafx-16 controller. There's all the buttons are in place here. Here's your turbo switches, and here's the inputs where they come in. We're going to take all of the little rubber pads and plastic buttons, D-pad, including the turbo switches. They just pop off. And we're going to place these in alcohol for about 30 minutes. Now you'll need your glass. Go ahead and put all the parts. I throw the screws in there too. And dump in your isopropyl alcohol. Doesn't need to be too high, just enough to fill it all. Okay. And we're gonna let that sit for about 30 minutes. Go ahead and empty the alcohol down the sink. Be careful not to drop any of your buttons or your screws down the sink, but empty the alcohol out of the glass. Next, I like to use a rag to dry off all the parts and screws. Once again, be careful here. You don't want to drop any of this on the floor, especially if you're around carpet. It gets really challenging to find the screws in carpet. Pat them off, dry them off. Sometimes some puddles get to form in some of these buttons, but you want to clean each one of these individually really good. Sometimes some puddles can accumulate here from the alcohol, so just make sure you're cleaning that off really well. We'll give it a chance to dry before we actually place it in the controller itself. And just for safety, I keep the screws on the rag, but that's up to your discretion. I've just lost so many of them in the carpet. Next, we're going to want to clean off the turbo switches, and specifically the connector. These little pins here on the turbo pad is what actually connects to the board. Take your good old-fashioned pink eraser from elementary school and start going back and forth and getting all the gunk. You're going to want to be firm here, but not too firm, as you don't want to bend these pins. But you do want to get the stuff off of them. I like to use the rag, clean it off a little bit more if you need to, after you're done scrubbing. And do the same for the other turbo switch. Next, we're going to start cleaning off the board. You're going to need some alcohol and your Q-tip. Dip it in there. I want to make sure that it's wet, but not soaking wet. And we're going to go over all the connectors. So this is where the D-pad connects, this is where your turbo switches connect, and here's where your buttons select, run, 1 and 2. Go over them with alcohol. You can actually just go over the entire board, but the connections are really the most important part. Oh man, there's a fair amount of dust. I get a fair amount of use out of my controllers, especially speedrunning. They get put through the paces, and you're cleaning off all the dust that's on them. As you can see, Q-tip gets pretty dirty. I like to use the eraser and go over those connections just to get off any gunk that may be there. The last thing we're going to do is clean the inside of the actual plastic controller part. Once again, I go over with the alcohol. Not too heavy on the alcohol this time, just where the connections might be. Some dust might have built up in there. Good quick once over. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. This is just to keep it clean. And then I dry it with the opposite end of the Q-tip. Okay, now the fun part, putting this whole thing back together. The pads and the buttons all have spots to line up in the controller, so putting this back together is pretty self-explanatory. The buttons fit right in. Plastic first, then rubber. Where are the buttons for the starts and run? Pop right in there. D-pad. Once again, it has little grooves on the D-pad for you to fit it right in. Turbo switches. There's a little groove on the side of the turbo switch that it fits into the plastic, so that's how you can line it up. And then the rubber part of the D-pad, once again, fits on this little hole here. Same thing with the actual 1 and 2 buttons. Finally, we place the board back on the controller. And once again, it's just a matter of lining up the holes. And put the cable itself, wrap it around the edges, fits in just like it did so before. Nice and in there. And you can place your back on top. Home stretch. Get our Phillips screws. And we're gonna screw these bad boys back in. That's pretty much it. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments below, and hopefully I can help you out. Thanks for watching.